Hey men, tonight we start with something very relatable. Sleep, or extra correctly, how medieval human beings slept, which seems to be a long way weirder than most of us ought to imagine. So earlier than you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but best if you truly enjoy what I do right here. And let me understand within the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it's miles for you. It's usually captivating to look who is joining us from around the arena. Now dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that tender heritage hum, and let's ease into this night's adventure collectively. Earlier than power, tick-tock, and sleep hygiene affects, medieval human beings approached midnight with an agenda that might baffle the cutting-edge melatonin enthusiast. It turned into called segmented sleep, a herbal two-part sleep cycle, split well in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The recurring was simple. After sunset, the general public became in early, drifting off into what became referred to as first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they had wake up intentionally and spend the next hour or two doing what can handiest be described as medieval middle-of-the-night multitasking. This wasn't taken into consideration insomnia. It was just how sleep worked. The watch period between the two sleeps turned into seen as practical, beneficial, and sometimes alarmingly social. Humans used this time to pray, study spiritual texts, tend fires, or check their farm animals because nothing ruins your REM cycle like wondering in case your goat remains within the yard. And yes, this changed into additionally taken into consideration the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals stated that the frame was properly rested and calm of mind during this period, which seems like a polite way of saying too worn out to argue. So, in case you ever idea you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner espresso, just recognize your ancestors have been setting the bar very otherwise. The second one sleep might observe this interlude, lasting until sunrise. Absolutely everyone from monks to farmers participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures like Chaucer casually mentioned it. Because of this that yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about now not drowsing nicely. Oddly enough, cutting-edge technological know-how has suggested that segmented sleep might definitely be extra herbal for human beings. The two-sleep cycle aligns with how our circadian rhythms work inside the absence of artificial light. So the next time you locate yourself wide unsleeping at 2:00 a.m., do not panic. Just whisper, "Ah, yes, the watch has started," and move have a tendency a symbolic fire. It wasn't until the industrial technology with factories, gas lamps, and the growing worry of unproductivity that humans commenced to put in force the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours, as though sleep were a timed recreation. Inside the medieval world, waking up within the nighttime wasn't failure. It turned into the schedule, and everybody changed into on it whether or not they preferred it or no longer. Let's communicate about beds, or as an alternative the medieval approximation of them. In present-day global, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a mattress turned into frequently just a pile of stuff that was once alive, now flattened below the load of poor sleep and unstated regrets. The typical peasant mattress consisted of a straw mattress referred to as a pallet. This was actually straw or hay crammed right into a sack of hard fabric, if they had the luxury of a sack. If now not, it changed into just straw at the floor, likely damp, in all likelihood already claimed through a cat. These pallets had been no longer comfortable. However, they were higher than not anything, which was the alternative. Straw turned into cheap, considerable, and good at insulating, in opposition to the bloodless. It became also outstanding at harboring bugs, lice, and the occasional subject mouse, which made snoozing an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you neglected it. If it bit, you just shifted slightly and was hopping for the nice. If a circle of relatives had a chunk more money, or at the least a practical return, they may raise the straw bed onto a wood body. This failed to change the sleep enjoyed dramatically. However, it did reduce the probabilities of waking up with beetles on your ear slightly. Linens were an extraordinary treat. Most people slept inside the clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't surely a component, and neither was private area. Complete families, kids, mother and father, maybe a grandparent, all slept together inside the equal space, once in a while on the same straw pile. If to procure too heat, you could continually roll into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Large wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets and canopies to preserve out the drafts and optimistically the lice. These beds had been so valuable, they have been surpassed down in wills. You failed to inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most medieval parents, a bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place to no longer freeze, to avoid the chickens, and perhaps, just perhaps, to dream of being wealthy enough to sooner or later sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear nightcap these days, we think about a comfortable little drink, maybe something with whiskey, a heat fire, and a questionable choice. However, in the middle a long time, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It became a hat. A real, tangible, regularly ridiculous searching piece of cloth, designed to hold your head from freezing off whilst you slept. You notice, insulation wasn't exactly the sturdy point of medieval structure. Stone partitions, drafty thatched roofs, and home windows made from thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do a whole lot in opposition to the cold. And central heating. That was referred to as a canine. So that you can preserve their heads warm at night, especially because frame warmth escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval humans adopted the common or garden nightcap. Those hats got here in all shapes and sizes, but the maximum iconic version became long and pointed, like something you'll expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They have been commonly crafted from wool, linen, or something scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the circle of relatives' goat. For men, it became a practical accessory. For girls, it from time to time doubled as a coif or head wrap, which additionally served the dual motive of retaining modesty and protecting hair that hadn't seen cleaning soap due to the fact closing Lent. But beyond warm temperature, nightcaps had social weight too. In a few areas, married girls were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even at the same time as asleep. And the cap itself may be embroidered or dyed to reflect a circle of relatives' wealth or status, because nothing says success like going to mattress with a mini flag for your cranium. In more city settings, the nightcap even became an image of being off-duty. If you opened your door sporting one, it was a polite medieval manner of announcing, "I am now not dressed for communication." And yes, this hat does suggest go away. Of course, nighttime caps had been regularly paired with nighttime shirts, which had been essentially lengthy, free tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't horny. However, it was realistic, itchy, and once in a while flammable. These days, the idea of slumbering subsequent to a stranger is commonly constrained to red-eye flights, overly formidable tenting journeys, or the occasional weird airman mix-up. However, in medieval Europe, this turned into completely regular and under no circumstances non-compulsory. Let's say you're a journeying merchant, a pilgrim, or simply a person whose mule gave up midway to Norwich. You discover and lodge, a unprecedented luxurious in itself, and ask for an area to sleep. What you get is not a room or a mattress or maybe a especially clean ground. What you get is a spot in a bed it's already occupied. Medieval inns operated extra like human bunkhouses than modern motels. Privacy turned into now not expected. If the bed had space, you had been sharing it, commonly with whole strangers who may snore, speak in their sleep, or have a suspicious wide variety of boils. This turned into no longer taken into consideration impolite. It changed into just efficient use of sources. Beds ought to host 2, 3, even 4 vacationers, depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you may end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and certainly zero private space. Snoring contests have been unjudged. Elbow territory became fiercely contested. Once in a while males and females had been separated, but now not continually. A few inns attempted to assign beds by means of profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves allegedly, but regularly it turned into first come, first sprawled. And whilst this could sound like a nightmare to fashionable germaphobes, again then it was an upgrade from slumbering outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant rebellion. Worried about robbery. Many tourists slept with their handbag tied to their belt or hidden underneath their garments. Others slept on top in their bundles, turning bags into both pillow and alarm system. If a person moved your bag, it generally meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, of course, did now not go through this destiny. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped in relative comfort, or demanded their personal rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof. Inside the medieval international, going to mattress wasn't pretty much pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It became a religious operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes had been your everlasting soul. People failed to simply sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Hence the popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleaning non-secular clauses, just in case they died somewhere between good night time and sunrise. The concept became easy. You can die at any second from illness, fire, demons, or maximum dangerously being over 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers, no longer because it became comforting, but because hell was terrifying and you didn't need to reveal up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually raveled. One not unusual version. If I need to die earlier than I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. A sweet rite. Except it is basically a felony report written by a 7-year-old acknowledging demise as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole catalog of prayers for distinct threats. One for whilst you had been feeling responsible. One for when you thought the Satan might be hiding within the rafters. One for plague prevention, which sadly aged poorly. A few even prayed to specific saints recognized for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul on the club door. The definitely religious priests, nuns, and overly demanding nobles ended their day with Compline, the final prayer provider before mattress. After Compline, they took a vow of silence, which wasn't hard because everybody became already exhausted, underfed, and mildly scared of the dark. Kids have been additionally endorsed to pray, an element because it turned into correct for his or her souls, and an element because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog changed into in their mattress again. Dad and Mom reminded them that angels had been watching, which sounds lovable until you realize it become much less father or mother angel, an extra celestial surveillance gadget. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think about it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it labored, even if you didn't absolutely apprehend how. In the modern-day global, dreams are generally dismissed as random nonsense. Strain, too much cheese, or your mind trying to record paperwork within the darkish. However, inside the medieval global, desires were taken very seriously, as in everlasting results serious. Dreams were not just dreams. They have been considered messages from God, saints, the devil, your dad or mum angel, or possibly that bizarre relic you kissed Ultimate Sunday. Some goals had been divine revelations, others had been demonic temptations. Both way, you had been presupposed to pay attention, and possibly write it down or confess it, or quickly for 3 days just to be secure. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming quantity of time interpreting desires. Entire texts had been dedicated to deciphering them. Dreamt of fireplace is probably hell. Dreamt of water could imply purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish. You'd better call a priest immediately and possibly fast. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered due to the fact your soul turned into nonetheless energetic while you slept. This supposed that your movements in a dream could reveal hidden sins or non-secular weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream, approximately stealing a loaf of bread. That might be your unconscious confessing your guilt for real international gluttony or just hunger. However, nonetheless, hire to confess it anyway just in case. Clergymen and nuns often recorded their goals and shared them with religious superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions for the duration of sleep. Others have been quietly advised to consume fewer onions before bed. Of root, dreams were not just religious puzzles. They also made superb plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences in which knights come upon angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry, approximately distinctive feature. Dreams were essentially the Netflix of the medieval international, besides with more allegory and less satisfied endings. The church predictably changed into suspicious. Now not all desires had been divine, and some had been believed to be planted by demons to deprave the harmless. If you dreamt of something unhealthful, it can suggest your soul turned into beneath assault, or that you just slept too close to the fire fumes again. In modern times, some humans let their pets sleep inside the mattress. It's a cozy, if once in a while smelly, arrangement. Within the Middle Ages, however, sharing a mattress with an animal wasn't a quirky private preference. It turned into a heating strategy. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Medieval houses weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone partitions, no insulation, drafts so aggressive they in all likelihood had names. Vital heating. That changed into called the circle of relatives pig. In peasant houses, it wasn't uncommon for people and cattle to sleep in the equal room, every now and then the same mattress, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled up at your feet. Pigs snorted softly beside the fireplace. And if you had been fortunate, none of them bit you all through the night. This wasn't about affection, even though medieval humans sincerely liked their animals. It became about survival. Animals generated frame warmness. They have been heat, dependable, and not like a few household, did not hog the blanket. A big dog should keep your FT from freezing. A cow within the nook might enhance the room temperature with the aid of a degree, or, which in January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, in particular the ones of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, consuming, sleeping, sometimes dying. Absolutely everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the identical space. Kids might be nestled among parents and a goat. A bird may function an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene. Permits no longer ask too many questions. For wealthier households, this wasn't as common. Nobles failed to commonly sleep subsequent to livestock, although they might still have lap puppies in mattress, no longer for warmth, but for style and flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate napping areas for favorite animals, due to the fact nothing says electricity like a canine, with its personal room and title. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals may be loud. They can wander. And they are now not, traditionally recognized for respecting personal space, but medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3:00 am. Just part of the bedtime recurring. If you've ever needed to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, that is a bit an awful lot, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place in which consolation went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries did not believe in personal space or softness, or amusing certainly. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks all dozing in a single large room, generally organized in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, had been regularly wooden planks, from time to time with a straw bed if the abbot turned into feeling generous, or it was a dinner party day. You slept fully clothed, not out of modesty, but because getting dressed inside the dark at 2:00 am for prayers turned into more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, consisting of gown, belt, and sandals, doubled as non-secular armor and bad insulation. If you obtained bloodless, you layered up. If to procure warm, well, no, you failed too. There were no pillows, no privateness curtains, and sincerely no speaking. Silence changed into enforced, no longer counseled, under the guideline of Saint Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you may locate yourself on chamber pot responsibility for per week. Loud night breathing, however, was a gray location. You could not control it, but if it have become disruptive, the Lord might nonetheless keep you accountable, or at least your cellmates would. Lighting was minimum. One candle maybe. You did not want to peer. You just needed to lie nevertheless, and now not sin. That turned into the intention. In spite of the austerity, clergymen believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife, preparation for the soul's journey with the aid of denying the flesh any excess. Sleep was not a pride. It became a necessity monitored and scheduled like the whole lot else. Some clergymen even slept sitting up, just to avoid any hint of luxurious or desires or move. In comparison to this, peasant straw piles and loud night-breathing pigs nearly seem pricey. As a minimum, the pig didn't judge you. Let's communicate approximately something that would horrify most current sleepers. Waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m. and now not for a bathroom spoil or a doom scroll, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this became fashionable practice. Priests and nuns followed a rigid daily agenda primarily based at the canonical hours, which covered matins, the primary service of the day. And by means of day, we imply the darkest part of the night time, when even the owls have been nonetheless finding out whether to wake up. The bell would toll, often rung by way of someone who drew the quick straw, and the whole dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls could shuffle off to the chapel in silence. And yes, still in full apparel, due to the fact priests did not do pajamas. The only layering machine they believed in was religious. In the chapel, with the aid of flickering candle mild, and beneath the echo of stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and try their exceptional not to nod off on their toes, which incidentally was a actual trouble. There are information of clergymen being punished for sound asleep mid-prayer, typically with extra chores or greater prayers. You fell asleep in matins. Congratulations, you currently get to guide the subsequent one. Matins should last an hour or extra. A few specifically enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged whilst your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your frame is actively shutting down. After the provider, monks would either go back to bed for their second sleep, or in stricter orders circulate immediately into examine or manual hard work, because not anything says holy area like thrashing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented relaxation. Why so early? The concept was to sacrifice comfort and devote the first and quietest a part of the night time to God, uninterrupted via the enticements of sunlight hours, warmth, or REM cycles. It was a powerful image of devotion. Or at least it turned into once you bought over the numb toes, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In the modern-day international, dozing on my own is regularly framed as a luxury, a signal of independence, peace, or just incapability to manipulate the blanket. In the medieval international, although napping alone was taken into consideration suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Allows start with the basics: warmth. Beds, as we have hooked up, weren't exactly toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys failed to do much to lure warmness, and central heating becomes still several plagues away. So human beings shared beds for frame warmth, no longer out of intimacy, but out of fundamental thermal desperation. Youngsters slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's youngster in the event that they had been traveling. It became like a sleepover, however nobody asked in case you wanted to be there. However, beyond warmth, there was a non-secular purpose for sleeping in organizations. Many human beings believed the night changed into, whilst the Satan worked additional time. By myself in the darkish, your soul is probably at risk of temptation or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a form of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, as a minimum, a person would witness it or seize the demon first. For children, Being on my own at night changed into practically unthinkable. Now not only for consolation, but due to the fact ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits had been all part of the nightly panorama. Stories warned in opposition to solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and religious peril. And unlike state-of-the-art bedtime testimonies, these stories did not lead to hugs. They resulted in disappearances. Even married couples regularly shared their beds with youngsters, servants, or random guests. Privacy became not an idea a lot as a contemporary myth. In reality, the idea of humans dozing alone in a large mattress was so overseas that it were considered either wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In spiritual contexts, even clergymen regularly slept communally. And if a person turned into a sign to sleep by myself, it became regularly for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in a few instances being by myself in bed turned into actually a punishment. Medieval logic, solitary sleep offers opportunity for sin. Group sleep. Public duty. Next time you're curled up on your personal mattress with your very own blanket in a room that doesn't scent like goat, enjoy the silence. In medieval instances, you'll likely have youngsters, a sheep canine and a cousin in there with you, all of them loud night breathing. In case you've ever by chance fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's ready room, you likely awakened with a crick for your neck and a deep sense of regret. However, inside the center a long time, slumbering upright wasn't in coincidence. It became a lifestyle. Some medieval oldsters, particularly the rich or religiously religious, selected to sleep propped up as opposed to lying flat. Why? Some motives, none of them in particular restful. First, there was a medical perception that mendacity flat turned into bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general stability of the physical humors. In a global wherein medical doctors thought a sneeze may want to rearrange your soul, this common sense made perfect sense. Upright snoozing, they believed, helped keep away from congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but generally meant don't drown to your own phlegm. 2D, there were religious concerns. Mendacity flat became considered too close to the posture of the lifeless. You failed to want to confuse God or worse, appeal to interest from the angel of dying by napping in the identical function used at funerals. Superstitious. Absolutely. However, whilst your nearby priest doubled as the network's fitness representative, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, human beings often slept partially reclined, supported by using big bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equal of a medieval lazy boy. Nobles on occasion had their beds rigged with angled supports to hold a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting one's night meat pie or warding off surprise demon assaults. Clergymen took it a step in addition. In stricter orders, they may even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning towards a cold wall with nothing however a hood to muffle the discomfort. It wasn't about fitness. It became about subject. If you had been too at ease, you may dream. If you dreamed, you may sin. In case you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5:00 a.m. Needless to mention, this wasn't about first-rate relaxation. It was about distinctive feature, soreness, and mildly puzzling theology. Forget about haunted ghouls or goblins under the bed. For medieval human beings, the real monsters of the night time had been already within the sheets, small, continual, and completely tired of your prayers. We're speaking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bed Trojan horse. Allows not sugar-coated. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's robust suit. Baths have been uncommon, laundry was expensive, and cleaning soap become every now and then crafted from substances higher left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional stay hen underfoot, and you have got the suitable environment for an all-you-may-consume pest buffet. Fleas and lice have been so commonplace, they were almost roommates. Peasants treated them every day. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were now not exempt. In reality, a few richer families had committed nitpickers, actual servants tasked with putting off lice from their corporation's hair and garb. Imagine that as your process title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bed bugs, meanwhile, have been the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They concealed in wood bed frames, bed seams, or even the cracks in stone partitions, rising at night time to dinner party like tiny vampires. In case you ever puzzled why medieval people wore nighttime caps and slept absolutely clothed, it wasn't always approximately warm temperature. On occasion it became pest defense armor. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some families burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or maybe ashes in the mattress, which may additionally have achieved little for the pests, but absolutely saved romance to a minimal. It wasn't just physical discomfort either. Fleas have been often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man, and negative bedding alternatives. Entire poems had been written approximately fleas, a few moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says I like you like. Allow us to be united like the flea that bites us both. So, whilst present-day sleep is interrupted by means of humming phones and road lighting fixtures, medieval sleep changed into much more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something changed into crawling for your shin because it turned into. We've all had restless nights. But have you ever tried falling asleep, even as carrying 100 lb of iron? No. Well, within the center a long time, some human beings did exactly that due to the fact reputedly not anything says sweet dreams like being organized to joust for your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, did not frequently sleep in complete armor. It became warm, heavy, and loud. Looking to roll over in an in shape of chain mail is a chunk like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or in adverse territory, sleeping partially armored turned into taken into consideration the safer desire. Consolation. Elective. Survival. Extraordinarily encouraged. A nighttime on marketing campaign would possibly put off simplest his helmet and gauntlets, maintaining his mail shirt or breastplate on just in case enemies decided to level a middle-of-the-night Marvel party. There's nothing pretty like waking as much as the sound of hooves, and having to fit up while nevertheless half of dreaming about turnips. In castles underneath siege, men-at-arms would possibly even sleep with swords or axes at their aspect, like some very aggressive bedtime protection blankets. Shields doubled as pillows. And if the enemy breached the partitions, well, at the least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities. Of course, napping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't always breathable, and chain mail has a horrific addiction of pinching skin. Add bloodless stone flooring, minimum bedding, and the ambient sounds of loud night-breathing comrades and crackling torches, and you were given a snooze surroundings that ranks somewhere beneath airport terminal at the consolation scale. Even the ones now not in struggle once in a while wore light protecting tools, whilst snoozing in dangerous areas. Traveling traders or guards on watch obligation would possibly nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets that offered a chunk of safety and barely extra padding than the moral aid of prayer alone. And lest we forget, armor wasn't precisely subtle. In case you rolled over the incorrect manner, you might clank so loudly that everyone else wakened and assumed the apocalypse had arrived once more. In a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs for your bed weren't taken into consideration unusual, you might suppose that sleepwalking was just one more medieval inconvenience. However, oh no, it was an awful lot greater dramatic than that. Within the center a long time, in case you started wandering around in your sleep, human beings did not chalk it as much as pressure or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished commercial enterprise with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the neighborhood monk, turned into poorly understood and frequently feared. The concept that a person could upward thrust from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall turned into less harmless parasomnia and more devil's rehearsal dinner. Money owed from the time recommend that people were surely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a protracted nighttime blouse, candle in hand, eyes glazed, mumbling Latin that he did not simply communicate even as stepping over cattle. You'd assume ghost or heretic or both. And depending for your neighborhood priest, an exorcism might be scheduled earlier than breakfast. A few believed sleepwalking turned into resulting from terrible humors, particularly an excessive amount of black bile, which became the medieval seers curious about something they could not explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was quickly released all through sleep, leaving the body unfastened to bumble round like an unattended mule. To save you these nightly adventures, human beings tried everything from natural remedies to praying over their beds, putting iron charms, or in greater rural areas, just tying the man or woman's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, do not forget that a few medieval houses had open hearths, knives anyplace, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned. In one curious twist, there were rumors of human beings mountain climbing onto rooftops of their sleep. Whether or not these bills have been exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers brought about barred home windows and coffee theological debates about whether a person may want to sin whilst subconscious. Happily, maximum sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or tried to open imaginary doorways. However, if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might deal with it as a divine sign or call for a cleaning ritual just to cowl all religious bases. If medieval lifestyles taught humans something, it became how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming farm animals, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the middle a long time, these were just ambient noises. The medieval version of white noise. Allows start with the bells. Church bells marked each sacred second of the day. Dawn, prayer times, food, and of course, the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably soundtracked by means of everyday tolling. At some point, the brain just commented. Bells have become the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms had been frequent and terrifying, and not using a climate apps or triple-glazed home windows, you experienced each clap of thunder just like the global might quit. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work failed to forestall for insomnia. Neither did plowing, praying, or strolling from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic occasions were not always a deal-breaker for bedtime either. In the 14th century, humans persisted to sleep some way through famine, battle, or even the black loss of life. Whilst demise carts rolled through within the morning, it became considered more of a grim wake-up name than a reason for panic. And if you did not wake up nicely, a few believed that became a mercy. There are even statistics of humans dozing through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation became common, and our bodies adjusted. In case you worked from sun up to solar down, ate slightly enough to continue to exist, and spent your day dodging mud, taxes, and religious damnation, you had been going to go to sleep hard. And then there were people who used sleep as a type of escape hatch. Confronted with infection, grief, or fear of the arena actually ending, which turned into forecast roughly each century, some humans just curled up below a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a sleep. There's an atypical type of awareness in that. Inside the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, became cloaked in more than simply snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet type of fear that seeped into the wood-framed homes and frozen fields. The human beings of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they had been constructing a holy community inside the wilderness, a metropolis on a hill watched through God and stalked by devil. Existence became already difficult. The village had recently split from Salem town over politics and faith. Crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged close-by communities. Wars with native tribes had left many traumatized. There was friction among acquaintances, inheritance disputes, and a deep resentment closer to outsiders or all and sundry who didn't quite match in. Add to this the lengthy, dark, bitter New England wintry weather, and something was bound to interrupt. That smash came within the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year vintage daughter, Betty, and 11-12 months vintage niece, Abigail Williams, started out to behave surprisingly. They screamed uncontrollably. They threw things. They contorted their bodies in unnatural methods. At times they fell silent for hours, eyes huge with terror. Acquaintances whispered that they were cursed. The women claimed they had been being pinched and bitten by way of invisible forces. Reverend Parris, unsure of what to do, called in a nearby health practitioner, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical reason, Griggs introduced the prognosis that might plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word set fire to the fears already simmering in Salem. In a place where witches had been believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea became now not far-fetched. And now, if the Satan should Trojan horse his way into the minister's own family, what did that mean for the relaxation of the community? The ladies, prodded by means of both adults and peers, commenced nomming names. First they accused girls at the margins, social misfits and outcasts. But quickly the accusations would reach the respectable, the rich, even the pious. Salem became a small village. However, what was approximately to turn up could echo a ways past its borders. What began as whispers in the dark would soon grow to be cries from the gallows, and a legacy of paranoia that also haunts the Use's history books. As soon as the concept of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at the start, then strangling the entirety it touched. The girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and shortly others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, appeared to grow bolder with each passing day. They convulsed in courtroom, screamed at some point of prayers, and claimed they may see dark spirits hovering over shore villages. It wasn't just formative years' imagination. It was theatrical, public, and most disturbingly believed. The primary to be accused had been those with the least protection, ladies who already lived on the edges of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, became acknowledged for muttering to herself when turned far from doorsteps. Human beings claimed her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe. She snapped at children. She enshaped the mold of a witch, due to the fact she failed to fit the mildew of a Puritan female. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over 12 months and had scandalized the network with the aid of marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A girl who defied convention, clearly suspect. Tituba, the enslaved female in Reverend Paris's household, changed into the maximum unusual of all. Originating from Barbados, her storytelling, accessory, and folklore worried the villagers. Under pressure, in all likelihood even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew it wide open. She advised a story of a tall man in black, a determined associated with the Satan, who requested her to signal a book. She said she noticed ordinary animals, yellow birds, crimson cats, or even spectral puppies. But most damning of all, she claimed there had been other witches in Salem. That changed into all the court docket had to listen. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through it. New names were added weekly. Acquaintances became on buddies. Vintage grudges were disguised as righteous accusations. Belongings disputes turned into spectral assaults. If someone's cow died abruptly, it ought to have been witchcraft. If a baby cried for the duration of a prayer, sincerely that changed into the Satan's doing. The concern became so infectious that not even the harmless dared to talk out. To protect an accused witch became to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence changed into safety. And so the internet of accusations widened, trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Common sense changed into fatting. Hysteria turned into now in control. As accusations set up and the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial authorities stepped in. Governor William Phipps, lately appointed and eager to preserve order, installed a special court to cope with the chaos. It became called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning, to hear and decide. But what it surely have become was a manufacturing unit for fear-driven justice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it turned into no everyday tribunal. Its rules have been warped by means of panic. Instead of requiring difficult proof or dependable witnesses, it allowed something a long way extra dangerous: spectral proof. Spectral proof was testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had stricken the victim. In other phrases, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream choking them, that became admissible in court docket. By no means thoughts that the accused will be asleep at church or miles away. It become their spirit doing the Satan's work. You could not go examine a dream. And worse, you couldn't disprove it. Children have been now treated as big-name witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court became more theatrical by using the day. One female, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. In the event that they failed to observe her, she shrieked louder. The performances have been enchanting, and the judges, which includes the influential Judge Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, customary at all. Defense attorneys. There were none. The idea didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood by myself. In case you denied the charges, the troubled girls writhed in affliction. If you confessed, you was perhaps spared loss of life, however only in case you named others. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. Worse nonetheless, the rigors became public spectacles. People traveled from close by towns to witness them. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, regularly bewildered, regularly poor, and nearly always powerless. And yet no longer everyone believed. A few cities folk whispered that the women were faking. Others puzzled why only sure types of people were being accused, but few spoke brazenly. Questioning the court docket meant questioning the need of God. In Salem, reason had stepped apart, and the law had become a reflecting worry, no longer justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She became not new to scandal. Her recognition made her an easy target. She wore brilliant purple garb, ran a tavern, and been accused of witchcraft years earlier. During her trial, associates testified that her spirit pinched them in the night, that their toddlers died after she passed via, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She denied the whole lot. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept patch of earth just outdoor Salem. No prayer, no mercy. The rope turned into pulled. The group watched, and with that single execution, the equipment of dying started to churn. The hangings that followed got here fast. On July 19th, 5 more girls have been done. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. A few had accurate status inside the church. Rebecca Nurse especially became a stunning case. An aged, pious woman loved within the community. Even the jury to begin with found her now not guilty. However, beneath pressure from the court docket and the afflicted girls, the verdict changed into reversed. Nurse's final phrases had been whispered through the air like a warning. "I'm as harmless as the child unborn." But it didn't count. The noose did no longer discriminate. In August, extra executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Amongst them turned into Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a distinct fate. Giles refused to go into a plea. The courtroom, unable to continue with a trial without one, resorted to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. He became pressed to loss of life. Stones had been piled on his chest slowly, cruelly, over 3 days. His very last phrases, as legend has it, were more weight. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people have been hanged, 1 pressed to dying, and at the least 5 greater died in prison awaiting trial. Dozens confessed falsely to keep their lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but in each heart. Fear had ended up law, and justice, blindfolded, have been caused the scaffold. At the same time as the executions claimed the spotlight, hundreds of others sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails, awaiting a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small prison could not comprise all of them. Accused witches have been held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to partitions, ravening, freezing, and forgotten. Most of the accused were not witches or maybe outcasts. They were friends, mother and father, kids, human beings whose most effective crime was having a quarrel with the wrong man or woman, or proudly owning land a person else wanted. In many cases, private grudges disguised as divine justice drove the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's backyard and died. Must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood. Truly, they had cursed the all. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca nurse, turned into one such case. She changed into a reputable mother of 7, recognized for her piety. To begin with, released by using the court docket, she turned into rearrested days later after new fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her destiny. In a very last petition to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but that they position a prevent to these court cases before extra harmless blood is shed. She turned into hanged soon after. Another incredible case became Dorothy Good, the 412-month-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated and under pressure confessed to being a witch. Her answers, gibberish and worry, were taken as truth. She was imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When finally released, she turned into mentally broken, never improving from the trauma. Pregnant girls had been no longer spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor might later cling, turned into discovered responsible and sentenced to die. However, due to the fact she became pregnant, her execution became not on time. It probably stored her lifestyles. She gave start in jail and turned into subsequently launched after the rigors ended. Accusations snowballed. A few accused confessed in desperation to keep away from demise, then named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Whole families have been pulled into the spiral. Fathers' other halves daughters, no person was beyond attain. Meanwhile, the jails swelled beyond ability. Meals changed into scarce. Ailments spread. Some died awaiting trial, misplaced within the felony limbo of paranoia, and still new names were added each week. In Salem, it now not mattered who you were, handiest who changed into inclined to say your call. Through the autumn of 1692, the spell of anxiety began to crack. Not because the court got here to its senses, however because fact pressured its manner returned in. The turning point came when accusations grew too formidable. Individuals who had as soon as supported the rigors found themselves abruptly on the wrong side of them. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, changed into arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was properly educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with influential households within the village. That was sufficient. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood at the gallows and perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed incapable of doing. The group fell silent. A few wept. Even hardened observers had been shaken, but the execution went on. That moment planted a seed of doubt. Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the spouse of Governor William Phipps. Unexpectedly, the hysteria had reached the top of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already unnerved with the aid of developing criticism and chaos, subsequently took motion. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had shifted. Ministers, as soon as silent or complicit, began to talk out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's maximum reputable theologians, denounced using spectral evidence. It had been better, he said, that 10 suspected witches ought to break out than one harmless character need to be condemned. A thorough concept in a society that had for months believed precisely the opposite. Those who had as soon as cheered the trials started out to query them. The jails were nonetheless full, but the appetite for greater blood had dulled. Too many reputable figures had been being accused. Too many innocent humans were buried. The villagers had started out to look that this wasn't divine justice. It was insanity. Confessions dried up. Some accusers backtracked. Others disappeared from public view. And people who had formerly shouted the loudest now reduced their eyes. The fear hadn't disappeared, however it had exhausted itself. The general public desired balance. The officials desired to keep face. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, turned into ultimately prepared to wake from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage, it had already been executed. With the aid of late 1692, the judicial gadget that had fueled the hysteria commenced to crumble beneath the burden of its personal absurdity. With the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, a new, more careful courtroom, the Superior Court of Judicature, was shaped in early 1693. This time things had been exceptional. Spectral evidence turned into no longer allowed, and the judges have been quite more skeptical of the accusers' wild claims. The result, the conviction slowed dramatically. Many accused witches have been acquitted outright. Of the 56 cases brought earlier than the brand new court docket, the majority were released. Even individuals who had already confessed started to recant their tales, admitting that fear, torture, or stress had forced them to lie. The dramatic performances of the women lost their persuasive energy. The most distinguished case in the unraveling of the pains turned into that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came underneath suspicion. Whilst he became never formally charged, the reality that such a high-ranking devout man will be suspected highlighted how arbitrary and corrupt the procedure had turned out to be. The court docket, once ferocious, was now cautious. They commenced quietly liberating those nevertheless in prison. First those with little proof towards them, and in the end, even individuals who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. In the meantime, households of the performed commenced to call for justice. John Proctor's kids petitioned for the return of his assets. Rebecca Nurse's family released a marketing campaign to clean her call. In time, network shame replaced network fear. Church congregations fractured. Friendships had been severed. The very cloth of Salem's social order have been shredded. Governor Phipps, figuring out the colony's growing global embarrassment, pardoned the closing prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came at a fee. Many households had to pay for their very own prison costs before being released. Consider dropping your own home, your fitness, and nearly your lifestyles most effective to be surpassed a bill for the privilege of surviving. Through the quit of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in prison, and over 200 had been accused. The court docket didn't just fall apart, it imploded, leaving in the back of a crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, however the recovery had no longer even started. Salem turned into a village all the time altered by means of the humans it had lost, the justice it had deserted, and the mirror it became now forced to look at. The gallows have been silent, the jails had emptied, but Salem turned into a ways from non-violent. The town wasn't haunted by way of ghosts, but by using guilt. What had started with a handful of ill women had exploded into a communal act of destruction. Households were torn aside, reputations ruined, and innocent lives ended. And now the survivors needed to stay in the wreckage. Friends could now not look each different in the eye. The identical folks who, as soon as prayed together, had testified towards one another. Some of the afflicted ladies quietly left city. Others diminished from the general public eye. A few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later express remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her position within the trials, blaming fantasy through Satan. However, for plenty, the harm was beyond phrases. The court officers, too, carried their burden. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the maximum outstanding figures within the trials, became one of the few to confess wrongdoing. In an extremely good act of public penance, he stood during a church carrier in 1697 while a minister read out his confession and prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of duty in a time while most tried to forget. However, forgetting wasn't easy. The households of the condemned started out annoying compensation. Through the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts authorities, inquiring for authentic pardons, for returned assets, for public acknowledgement that the performed had been innocent. Slowly, the government answered. In 1711, the colony surpassed an invoice restoring the rights and top names of some of the sufferers, and presented limited monetary restitution to their heirs. But even that wasn't complete. Some households, just like the Coreys and the Proctors, were ignored entirely. Whispers of witchcraft in no way pretty left New England, but in Salem, the shame became part of the city's identification. The village finally changed its call to Danvers, perhaps to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was by no means officially marked, as though the city was hopping to bury no longer just the useless, however the reminiscence of what had befell. However, the memory persisted in sermons, in memories, inside the silence among former pals. Salem had no longer been cursed by using witches. It had been cursed through worry, by means of pleasure, and by unchecked electricity. And that curse would linger lengthy after the execution stopped. The Salem witch trials ended greater than 3 centuries ago. However, their legacy keeps to echo, not simply in textbooks and ancient lore, however in how we recognize justice, worry, and the fragility of fact. What came about in 1692 wasn't genuinely an unusual episode of mass hysteria. It became a breakdown of logic, compassion, and prison integrity inside the face of panic. Regular human beings, farmers, midwives, ministers have become executioners simply by believing too without difficulty and thinking too little. The courts meant to defend the harmless became equipment of oppression. Faith became weaponized. Testimony have become theater. And silence became guilt. One of the most chilling factors of Salem's tragedy is how quickly it opened up. In a count number of months, fear overcame fact. Old grudges disguised as spiritual struggle became demise sentences. It didn't take demons or devils. It handiest took belief in them. However, the trials also taught tough-earned lessons that would ripple through American society. Within the years and centuries that observed, the Salem episode would be cited again and again in debates about due system and civil liberties. America Charter, written nearly a century later, could explicitly prohibit things like asterisk ex post fact, legal guidelines, and payments of attainder, measures that had in effect doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantee of a proper to criminal counsel, the right to face your accusers, and the requirement for concrete proof were hard-won concepts forged in component from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the word witch hunt has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's frequently used with little regard for the real terror the one's words represent. In fact, Salem was no longer a metaphor. It was a metropolis in which people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed with the aid of the very systems designed to defend them. Perhaps the maximum lasting lesson is that this worry unchecked can turn out to be its very own shape of tyranny. And whilst fear is legitimized via energy, by way of courts, with the aid of church buildings, by means of governments, it turns into almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary story, now not just of one village's descent into madness, however of ways without difficulty cause can fall whilst worry is given authority. The gallows can be long gone, the courtrooms quiet, but the warning nevertheless stands. Fact is fragile. Justice isn't automatic, and records has a habit of repeating itself, except we take into account. Fulvia changed into born round 83 B.C. Lee into the elite but slightly eccentric Fulvia family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the higher echelons of Roman politics. Even though now not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvii had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was regarded extra for his bumbling speech than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio literally stated his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. She was born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by means of the sharp-edged international of Roman strength. Senators and generals debated policy in her domestic. Elections and treachery had been day-by-day news. She would have seen how politics wasn't simply played within the discussion board, but in marriages, funerals, rumors, and backroom offers. Girls in elite Roman households were anticipated to be quiet companions, subtle, knowledgeable, and obedient. Fulvia would break all of those expectancies. She became rich, distinctly educated and connected, and he or she knew it. While her youth remains hazy within the historical report, her later actions suggest a young woman who became observant, politically literate, and wholly unafraid. This wasn't someone who dwindled into the history. She had a robust character, a pointy political thoughts, and a will to behave even within the male-dominated area of Roman governance. This turned into also a period of extraordinary instability. The Republic turned into unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and electricity struggles among generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar have been turning Rome right into a stress cooker. The old guidelines were collapsing, and Fulvia got here of age proper in the center of it. In preference to recoil from chaos, Fulvia would learn how to use it. Her formative years failed to produce the sort of modest matron Rome idealized. It produced a female who saw politics not as a person's international to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would cross on to marry 3 powerful guys, every one an intensive participant in Roman records, but Fulvia wouldn't just marry electricity. She might command armies, lead revolts, and come to be the primary Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, however as herself. Rome wasn't prepared for Fulvia, however she turned into prepared for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage became to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it became anything but traditional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He turned into a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level strength. To a number of the Roman elite, he changed into risky. To the Lords, he changed into a hero. And to Fulvia, he turned into a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime within the early 50s B.C., united Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his own stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had as soon as disguised himself as a female to infiltrate a sacred, female-only religious rite in Caesar's domestic. Scandalous behavior that handiest appeared to raise his reputation. He later renounced his patrician popularity to run for the tribunate of the plebs, and workplace that gave him veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's road politics higher than Maximum, and Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, changed into right there beside him. She wasn't a silent accomplice. Roman assets proposed that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political international. She engaged together with his supporters, become seen at some point of his campaigns, and controlled their household as a hub for Clodius's politics. Collectively, they represented a brand new kind of Roman strength couple, formidable, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But the alliance got here at a fee. In 52 B.C., Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by using the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His demise sent shock waves through Rome, but Fulvia became now not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians nevertheless talk about these days. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman discussion board, bloodied wounds exposed for max impact. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House changed into burn to the ground. Fulvia had grew to become private grief into public rebellion. This was her first foremost political act, and it worked. Her potential to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as method, and wield her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a brand new type of participant in Roman politics. Clodius turned into long gone, however Fulvia had stepped out of the shadow, and Rome could by no means see her the equal manner once more. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a quick shelf life, and she understood that higher than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a 2D marriage. This time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political celebrity and one among Julius Caesar's maximum passionate supporters. At the surface, Curio appeared an unlikely suit. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama, but under the bravado turned into a sharp political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 B.C., Curio wielded extensive have an effect on, at some point of one among Rome's most risky durations. The Republic teetered between conflict and peace, between Caesar's goals and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio now not only a husband, however a bridge to the subsequent power block. This was no romantic rebound. It became a calculated alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia wished a brand new political anchor. A person who should bring ahead the populist legacy her first husband had built, and a person who had Caesar's backing. Curio and shape each bills. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded inside the shifting electricity dynamics of Rome. She did not just marry into the motion, she helped form it. Fulvia ensured Clodius's supporters stayed active, rebranding their motive beneath Curio's leadership and retaining the urban loads politically engaged. But the Roman global became collapsing rapid. Tensions among Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil conflict. Curio threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's facet. Fulvia, as usually, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped prepare, guide, and control assets for her husband's marketing campaign. In 49 B.C., Curio led a military excursion to Africa to secure Caesar's function. However, it changed into a catastrophe. He became ambushed and killed via the forces of King Juba of Numidia. His death turned into brutal, and his military annihilated. Another time, Fulvia was widowed. And over again, Rome waited to see if she could fade into the background. She did not. Curio's dying only solidified her repute as a political widow, with risky resilience. She had now misplaced two husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and each had died preventing for populist causes. However, Fulvia was far from completed. Her maximum audacious partnership and her most dramatic bankruptcy became nonetheless to come back. Fulvia's third and maximum famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the formidable, well-known, and dependable ally of Julius Caesar. Their union cast sometime around 47 B.C. wasn't simply a romantic attachment. It was a merger of strength. Fulvia had already proven herself as a grasp of Roman street politics. Antony, growing swiftly via the military and political ranks, needed that type of savvy help in Rome. Together they formed one of the maximum, politically, amazing couples of the past due republic. By the time in their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried husbands and outmaneuvered infinite enemies. Antony changed into no stranger to scandal either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal lifestyles turned into notoriously chaotic. However, with Fulvia, he had discovered someone who may want to do greater than entertain him. She may want to guard his interests, preserve his alliances together, and rally supporters while he was away on marketing campaign. And Antony, no matter his brash outdoors, understood her cost. He allowed Fulvia to exercise authority that no Roman girl had publicly wielded earlier then. She opened his correspondence. She issued orders in his absence. She sat in on meetings and encouraged appointments. Roman sources, usually hostile, depicted her as overbearing and energy-hungry, but what disturbed them maximum wasn't her ambition. It became that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language for this sort of woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 B.C., the Republic plunged into chaos over again. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his consultant in the capital, dealing with patronage networks, coordinating with avenue gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized. She even helped arrange Antony's legitimate reconciliation with Octavian, with the aid of marrying her daughter Clodia to him, an alliance that could later implode. In public, Fulvia appeared now not just as Antony's spouse, but as his proxy. Roman cash were minted, bearing both Antony's photograph and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status. She wasn't hidden within the shadows of strength. She stood in its full glare. However, power in Rome turned into constantly borrowed, and Fulvia turned into approximately to test the boundaries of how a long way a woman ought to pass earlier than Rome snapped again. At the same time as Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman international, it became Fulvia who managed the streets of Rome. She wasn't simply his spouse. She became his regent in all but call. In a period where violence, bribery, and uncooked have an effect on stored order, Fulvia proves she may want to play the sport in addition to, if now not better than any man within the Senate. Rome, within the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, was a battlefield without swords. Power had grown to be a transferring target. Fulvia understood this, and she anchored Antony's authority inside the capital with the aid of turning into his political substitute. She directed allies, handled the urban plebs, negotiated with factions, and most daringly waged war with words and silver. She financed dependable troops, supplied bribes to maintain public order, and ensured that any legislation surpassed desired Antony's destiny. Some historical sources, particularly adversarial ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even warmongering. However, underneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies a woman actively doing politics in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing whatever past weaving and mourning. Fulvia changed into building coalitions, backing army commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions typically reserved for senators and consuls. She also made public appearances and maintained robust relationships with veteran squatties, a politically vital demographic in the electricity struggles of the overdue republic. At the same time as Antony began campaigning within the East, Fulvia changed into often the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing choices about land distribution, and reminding the squatties that their loyalty to Antony got here with rewards. But this accumulation of strength got here at a value. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's increasingly more bitter rival, resented Fulvia's have an effect on. They regarded her as a meddling female with an excessive amount of sway over legions, legal guidelines, and loyalties. Her ability to behave without male guardianship was no longer just threatening, it was extraordinary. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the anxiety among Antony and Octavian become growing. She could see that their alliance become cracking, and he or she understood something that neither man appeared to absolutely grasp, but the Republic wasn't big sufficient for both of them. So Fulvia commenced preparing for the subsequent phase. No longer diplomacy, however disagreement. She had stood behind power lengthy enough. Now she turned into ready to take it into her personal palms. In 41 C. Lee, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the destiny Augustus, and she or he didn't do it quietly. With her husband Mark Antony nonetheless stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to project Octavian's authority in Italy. The purpose? Ostensibly, it became to guard Antony's hobbies and shield the land rights of Roman veterans dependable to him. However, underneath all of it, Fulvia's fingerprints had been everywhere. This was now not just politics. This was a military rebel led via a Roman female, the first and simplest time in Roman history that a woman might actively initiate and organize a civil struggle. The struggle, known as the Perusian War, changed into precipitated by using Octavian's arguable land redistribution software, which displaced many Italians to reward his infantrymen. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius acting as her frontman in the Senate and Fulvia organizing behind the curtain, they raised 8 legions and seized the town of Perusia, current-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this turned into Fulvia's war. Historical sources endorse she became more invested in the warfare than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred the general public, or even corresponded with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders and forcing Lucius into confrontations he did not want. Octavian, though amazed, acted fast. He besieged Perusia through the iciness of 4140 B.C., slicing off materials and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, caught among dwindling meals and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By using early 40 B.C., the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius turned into spared, likely as a gesture to keep away from alienating Antony, but Fulvia changed into exiled. The lady who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion turned into now deemed too risky for Roman soil. She changed into dispatched to Sicyon in Greece, in which she hoped to reunite with Antony. However, Antony did not come jogging. The as soon as powerful alliance among husband and wife had eroded in the fog of conflict and distance. Fulvia had acted in his call, but possibly without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman female had before, salary a civil struggle. And now the Republic had made her pay the rate. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had come to be a sort of diplomatic purgatory for failed strength gamers. She had gone to war, no longer for non-public gain, but in her husband's call. She believed she changed into defending Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and possibly their shared imaginative impression of Rome. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It became silence. Fulvia had risked everything, her popularity, her alliances, her life. And yet Antony did now not straightway rush to satisfy her. In truth, by the point Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic dating had begun or changed into merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing. Even as Fulvia turned into raising legions, Antony turned into raising goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, now not just in my view but politically. Fulvia had fought a struggle to guard Antony's electricity in Italy, and in response, he let her dangle out to dry. A few historical historians, mainly Plutarch, advocate that Antony become furious along with her for launching the Perusian War without his direct approval. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the manner for a wedding alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia might have in no way tolerated. Still, Fulvia wasn't completely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely dependable to her, urged reconciliation. But her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 B.C. Possibly from contamination, pressure, or heartbreak, or all three. She was around 43 years old. Her loss of life furnished Antony with a clean political go-out. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as a part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs had been quickly united again, but handiest due to the fact Fulvia, the only lady formidable sufficient to project their designs, turned into gone. Fulvia's legacy might quickly be overshadowed by using Cleopatra, whose myths almost every Roman lady of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She failed to wield strength from in the back of a curtain. She marched into it, stood at the center, and dared to command armies in a global that dealt with girls as fixtures. Rome didn't understand what to do along with her, so it erased her. But the ashes of her riot might linger, and her tale was some distance from every day. After Fulvia's loss of life in 40 B.C., the men she had as soon as maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, or even her former allies, started the quiet paintings of rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the narrative turned into fashion by using her enemies and the uneasy survivors of her ambition. And like such a lot of effective ladies in history, Fulvia have become a scapegoat. Historic resources, by and large penned by way of men with vested hobbies, painted her as the purpose for the Perusian War, the rift among Antony and Octavian, or even the general ailment of the Republic. Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by a lust for energy. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for antagonizing Octavian, or even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome. However, were these accusations truthful? Hardly. Fulvia had operated inside a political climate wherein violence and manipulation have been anticipated, at the least if you have been a man. She became no more ambitious than Caesar, no extra competitive than Pompey, and a ways less ruthless than Octavian could sooner or later prove to be. Her handiest proper deviation was that she was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome didn't understand the way to digest that. She wasn't cloistered in the domestic, weaving quietly or serving as a political decoration. She became writing letters to generals, organizing avenue mobs, and commanding loyalty from troops. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian but to records itself. Even Mark Antony, the person whose legacy she had fought to preserve, quite conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's dying as a diplomatic cleaning. Her reminiscence became the rate of his political survival. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral, no morning speeches in the Senate, just silence. But her enemies couldn't erase her entirely. Fulvia had performed too much. She had raised armies, instructed elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She turned into the first Roman woman whose call appeared on coinage, no longer as a deity or metaphor, but as a political agent. The damage to her reputation became deliberate, but so became her presence inside the ancient record. Despite every try and bury her at the back of caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to disappear. Her defiance still echoes. You just need to listen past the men. Fulvia's tale ends in silence, but her legacy is something, however, quiet. In the centuries that accompanied her death, historians and writers struggled to vicinity her in Rome's grand narrative, due to the fact Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman female was speculated to be. She did not just endorse power from the shadows, she became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal international. In a society where ladies had been expected to persuade through whisper and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was no longer a consort. She turned into a commander. And yet, she became remembered greater for her defiance than her accomplishments. Roman historians couldn't deal with a female who didn't stay in her vicinity, in order that they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But examine among the lines, and an extraordinary figure emerges. Fulvia became the first Roman girl to mint cash along with her name. She organized political factions, leveraged marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with beautiful effectiveness. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century B.C. Now not as a bystander, but as a participant, a female whose influence terrified senators and fashioned the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall wasn't because of incompetence. It changed into due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a greater charming Cato. As an alternative, she becomes solid as the wicked lady who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman girls like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, or even Cleopatra herself, although of a distinctive global, could all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They might manipulate emperors, wield armies, and manage succession. But Fulvia did it first, and without an imperial name to defend her. Nowadays, modern-day historians have all started re-examining Fulvia with sparkling eyes. Now not a cautionary story, she is being recognized as one of the most politically energetic women in Roman history, someone who examined the boundaries of girl electricity and paid the price. She didn't absolutely stay in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And at the same time as Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every nook of its crumble. Now not a footnote, a pressure. A woman centuries in advance of her time. By way of the summer of 1963, the United States became a rustic teetering among worlds. One rooted in centuries-old structures of oppression, and another aching to respire free. Inside the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm. It changed into the regulation. Black people had been barred from eating places, faculties, buses, balloting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality became rampant. Lynching still befell, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, non-violent protesters were being met with snarling dogs and excessive press fireplace hoses. But change began coming, and it wasn't requesting permission. In only a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national highlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had emerged as familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis had been now not just names. They have been symbols of defiance. The March on Washington wasn't born out of a single conversation. It changed into the result of growing frustration and fierce hope. Black people had been now not content material with ready. They had been demanding civil rights, and they had been decided to make their voices heard in which it mattered maximum, the country's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. have been floating round for many years. Lay. Philip Randolph, a hard work organizer and longtime civil rights suggest, had at the start proposed the idea inside the 1940s. Again then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt management to desegregate the defense enterprise. That protest became known as off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order. But now in 1963, the stakes were even better. Randolph, in conjunction with other civil rights leaders, together with Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they were not just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for balloting rights, for faculty desegregation, for same pay, and most importantly, for the fundamental human proper to live freed from fear. Over a dozen fundamental civil rights organizations came collectively to plot it in spite of their many disagreements, because they understood the electricity of a unified the front. The countdown had started. Buses had been being prepared. Flyers have been spreading. Word of mouth changed into moving faster than newspapers. And across the country, Black Americans had been preparing for what might emerge as one of the most unforgettable moments in American records. The dream was taking shape one footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any type in Washington, D.C. turned into no small feat, but making plans one for over 100,000 humans, in all likelihood more, became madness. Logistically, it seemed like a nightmare. Meals, water, transportation, sound systems, lavatories, clinical groups, permits, crowd control, protection plans. And yet in some way, they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, regardless of being brazenly homosexual and regularly kept behind the curtain for political reasons, became a grasp strategist. Rustin had as soon as studied nonviolence, without delay, under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, overwhelmed, and surveilled with the aid of the FBI. But nothing fazed him. He noticed the march on Washington as a hazard to reveal the arena what disciplined, nonviolent protest ought to achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his group transformed the concept into a reality. The march was officially known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it changed into deliberately framed to consist of each racial justice and financial possibility. That dual message changed into no twist of fate. At the same time as Dr. King would later become the religious symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the needs had been just as a great deal approximately unemployment, minimal wage, and employees' rights as they had been approximately civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the floor. President John F. Kennedy and his management were anxious, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the country-wide shield became on standby. Hospitals in D.C. had been placed on alert, and liquor income have been banned for the day. Federal employees have been even told they could stay domestic. And then there was the question of solidarity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, regularly clashed over tactics. Some desired more radical movement, others extra diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands had been growing impatient with King's nonviolent method, but they all agreed on this: The time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Each bus and educate changed into tract. Each speaker was timed to the minute. Each path had marshals educated in crowd manage. They were not just making plans a march. They have been orchestrating a second that might shake the conscience of a state. August 28, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The solar was already warm by means of 9:00 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. However, it failed to forestall them. From every corner of the USA they came. Black, white, younger, old, college students, clergy, manufacturing facility workers, and celebrities. A few wore their Sunday quality, others clutched protest signs and symptoms. They came with the aid of bus, teach, carpool, and even foot. Over 250,000 humans, in general converging on the National Mall, like a growing tide of hope. And yet there was no chaos. Notwithstanding the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot visitors. The pink pass surpassed out water. Businesses sang freedom songs, held arms, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You can hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of jobs and freedom, echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one changed into there for autographs. They have been there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one individual. The crowd became orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. As an alternative, there was a shared information that this wasn't only a protest. It changed into a sacred moment. For lots of black individuals, simply standing at the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be visible, to matter, to mention, we are right here in the front of the same Lincoln Memorial wherein the exceptional emancipator sat in stone. It became a complete circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly midday, the official software began. Leaders took the stage one after the other, every representing distinctive groups, ideologies, and regions, however united in message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a reciting salary, and an give up to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had as soon as been banned from singing at Constitution Hall due to her race, now sang for hundreds underneath the open sky. Because the hours surpassed, the anxiety grew, no longer from unrest but from anticipation. The man all people changed into looking forward to had now not but spoken. And whilst he did, the arena might prevent, concentrate, and don't forget. The march wasn't just making history. It was turning into legend minute by minute. By way of mid-afternoon, the gang had grown quiet, not due to the fact they were tired, but due to the fact they knew what turned into coming. Standing within the coloration of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark fit, a smartly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely hid the fire constructing interior him. He carried organized comments, typed and written collaboratively together with his advisors the night before. However, what the arena would recall wasn't what had been typed. It became what came from his heart. He commenced with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and damaged guarantees. 100 years later, he said, relating to the Emancipation Proclamation, The Negro is still no longer loose. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence, not as fillers, however, as devices. The group listened in rapt interest, a few nodding, a few wiping away tears, others holding signs and symptoms that truly study now. But it changed into what befell next that changed the tone of the entire occasion, and arguably, the trajectory of the civil rights motion itself. Standing just at the back of King changed into gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Inform them approximately the dream, Martin. Inform them approximately the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the rostrum, and launched into a passage he'd delivered earlier then, however never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the group leaned in. "I have a dream that sooner or later this kingdom will rise up and live out the real meaning of its creed." Every word rang louder, clearer, extra resolute. "I have a dream that at some point, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together on the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little kids will sooner or later live in a country in which they may now not be judged by means of the shade in their pores and skin, however, by using the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was an imaginative and prescient, a prayer, a lightning bolt through records. By the time King closed with the phrases, "Loose at remaining," "Loose at last," "Thank God Almighty," "We are unfastened at remaining," the group erupted. Applause, tears, shouts of pleasure. They knew that they had just witnessed something extra than oratory. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just inside the speeches or the song. It became in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day changed into overwhelming. They got here from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some have been seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had by no means left their hometowns till now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept of their church garments just to be there. Many had been ordinary humans, maids, instructors, metallic employees, postal clerks, who noticed themselves not as political figures but as witnesses. They did not just want change. They had been the alternate. There have been additionally youngsters inside the crowd, younger black girls with ribbons of their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents hoisted bobbies onto their shoulders so they might see the Lincoln Memorial inside the distance and listen the speaker voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event. It changed into the beginning of a new world. A few faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years vintage, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech was so fiery, so uncompromising that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes earlier than he went on stage. He agreed, however, just slightly. His name for radical change nevertheless shook the group. After which there was Daisy Bates, the most effective girl to talk that day, no longer on her very own behalf, but studying a prepared statement on behalf of different civil rights girls. The organizers had confronted criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's short but effective message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, a few voices nevertheless struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, monks, and college students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some preferred King's nonviolence. Others leaned closer to Malcolm X's greater militant posture. But for that, at some point, those differences did not rely. Team Unit won out. It was a visual symphony of American opportunity. White and black hands linked in harmony. Freedom now buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls' respiration as one. The faces within the crowd were not just looking history unfold. They had been shaping it, and none of them would ever forget about what they saw. Even as the sector noticed solidarity, proposal, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the curtain, the March on Washington became something, however simple. What gave the impression of a perfectly synchronized motion was in truth held together with string, sweat, and plenty of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the leader architect of the march, needed to war not just logistics but politics. He was constantly beneath scrutiny, no longer just because he changed into brazenly homosexual and a former communist, but due to the fact some civil rights leaders feared his identity might be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't dispose of Rustin from an earlier campaign. That risk haunted each stage of making plans. Then there was the problem of ladies' voices. Regardless of the crucial roles played via girls like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver principal speeches on their personal. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by means of all, however she changed into not given the microphone. In the back of the powerful optics of the march lay the fact: the movement nonetheless struggled with its personal hierarchies and blind spots. Even inside the Big Six agencies, friction bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly dissatisfied with the sluggish pace of alternate and the older technology's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had comparable frustrations, but harmony changed into deemed too essential only for someday. In the meantime, the federal government watched with clenched enamel. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 dealers to spy on organizers. They bugged lodge rooms, accompanied key figures, and compiled dossiers. They had been satisfied the march might turn violent, or that communists might hijack the event. While not anything of the kind befell, they truly doubled down on their surveillance, specifically of Dr. King. And allows not forget cash. The march price over $250,000, equal to thousands and thousands these days. Most of it turned into raised through unions and sympathetic donors. However, organizers scrambled until the very last hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington changed into historical, sure. However, it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished, similar to the United States of America it sought to heal. The sun started to dip in the back of the Washington Monument because the crowds slowly dispersed. Human beings hugged, cried, sang, and lingered so long as they may, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred floor. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised excessive. The sector had watched. And now the query hung heavy within the humid August air: what occurs subsequent? Within the immediately days that accompanied, the media reaction became carefully positive. Critical newspapers reported the historic nature of the occasion, though often with a tone of indifferent curiosity. a few referred to as it orderly and dignified, which was code for no one rioted. Few stores gave a lot area to the specific needs of the march, just like the name for a federal job software or a $2 minimal wage, equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone protected Dr. King's speech. That at least could not be neglected. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the concept of the march, watched it unfold on TV with growing admiration and perhaps wonder. He known as the event Wonderful and met with civil rights leaders on the white residence straight away afterward, but legislative motion remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught within the claws of Southern competition. Some activists were upset. They was hoping the march would bring about instantaneous movement. Instead, it was lower back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning people who paid the price for justice. Simply weeks later, that reality hit difficult. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Road Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream were voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had modified. The March on Washington marked a new phase within the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest may be disciplined, powerful, and not possible to disregard. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before. Exertions unions, religion leaders, celebrities, college students, and working-class Americans, all in one area, united by using justice. And maximum of all, it gave the motion a voice. A dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world. The march was over, but the street turned into just starting. And that avenue could soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington did not just rattle the conscience of the USA. It reshaped its ethical landscape. What had started as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how individuals understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march did not yield instantaneous victories, but it created momentum. Much less than 12 months later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based totally on race, coloration, religion, sex, or country-wide origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, hanging on the very coronary heart of Jim Crow laws. Could those bills have passed without the march? Probably. But would they have had the same moral force, the identical simple public stress? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to worldwide icon. However, reputation got here with fee, surveillance, threats, and in the long run assassination in 1968. The dream he pointed out on those steps could turn out to be more poignant, greater tragic, and greater respected with every passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what cohesion could acquire. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it stimulated a generation of activists both inside the U.S. and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, pupil protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe might cite the March on Washington as a version. But the legacy isn't just historic. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I Have a Dream" still pulses through contemporary protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign in Washington, D.C. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness, carved in stone with words from that August day etched into the granite. However, the actual memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to live silent, because the dream wasn't intended to relaxation in history books. It changed into intended to be lived. And the legacy of that summer season afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summertime afternoon, whilst over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder below the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum well-known shows. Dr. King's speech is taught in colleges. His voice, regular and strong, echoes in country-wide memory like a sacred chorus. However, for plenty, the question remains, has the dream been realized or has it merely been delayed? In a few methods, progress is simple. The prison framework of segregation turned into dismantled. Balloting rights, although now beneath sparkling attack in lots of states, had been received through blood, marches, and court docket battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president changed into unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once unlawful in a good deal of the US of A, is now blanketed through federal regulation. These aren't small things. They are victories carved out by means of relentless struggle. And yet the unique demands of the march, those frequently overshadowed by way of King's speech, nevertheless echo unresolved. The decision for a reciting wage, nonetheless unmet. Racial disparities in schooling, housing, employment, and healthcare remain entrenched. Police brutality, the very issue that sparked a lot of the early civil rights organizing, keeps to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of genuine monetary justice, of a rustic in which possibility isn't predetermined by zip code or skin shade, is still far from fact. Current movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, frequently the usage of the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both thought and indictment. They march through the identical towns, chant at the identical streets, and call for the identical fundamental human rights. However, they accomplish that in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new styles of resistance. The March on Washington was by no means meant to be the realization. It changed into a flash factor, a stake in the floor that stated, "That is who we are and this is what we demand." It turned into a statement, now not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether its miles deferred, distorted, or sooner or later fulfilled relies upon not at the past, however, on us. At the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the braveness we summon to march time and again until the dream will become a shared lived fact.